Hello and welcome back to Parley, my on-the-spot responses to the prompts you folks submit. This one is from JustRusty. It's a defense of stat soup in games. It's soup season, JustRusty begins, and I want to talk about my current buildcraft darling, The Last Spell. I think there are lots of good buildcraft lessons to be learned from it, but today I want to talk about its stats system, because I think it's kind of magical. The grounding we need for this one is that it's a base defense game, where 3 to 6 heroes fight like 100 plus monsters a night in turn-based combat with the help of some towers and defenses, and there's 10-ish nights in a run. Each hero starts out as a blank slate, mostly, barring minor stat changes and perk options. Each hero can carry 2 weapon sets, and each one gives you 4-ish skills, each hitting in a different pattern, 1 or 2 moves needing mana. Every weapon has some type of skill which uses mana, even non-magic ones that'll be relevant later. Weapons can be physical, ranged, or magic. Physical are mostly melee, range are mostly like a ranged option as you would expect, and magic ones are mostly weirder effects or like utility focused. Every time a hero levels up, they take 1 bump in a primary stat, 1 bump in a secondary stat, and a perk, which we don't really have time for in this parlay. Just Rusty's words, not mine. I don't know. I'm interested. This is probably enough setup to discuss the absolute melange of stats available. I've included a picture of the character sheet the game uses for each hero for this parlay. We're interested in the bit in red and the bit in blue. So you can see there's the top left and then the, most of it, but the bottom right, basically. And here's where you can see the parlay coming into focus. That's a lot of stats. There's there's a number of stats. Now, if you, like me, have seen a game that has a lot of little numbers in it like this, you'll have learned by now that usually very few of them are relevant, or you can't even really deliberately control or like do anything specific with that many of them necessarily. But I would say that's bad. If there are a lot of decision points, it is not good if they don't add fun to the game. I think it's worth unpacking this for this parlay. What's the problem with stat soup? Why does it need defending? And I would say that the short answer is that it's not good to make a game more complicated unless it creates fun, unless it generates more fun. It's not simply inherently fun to make something more complicated without some direction or way to convert that into a benefit where it's then fun somehow. It's an interesting decision, or there are some games that are of the quality where the big melange of stats is kind of like a puzzle to be solved. I sort of hate that and feel like it's usually sort of trying to be a build system but just failing. But I feel like you could do that, and some games do that in a way where you're meant to puzzle it out. The problem with those is often that if there is a solution, or it can be presented as if there is one like single solution, you could just look it up and then the community will just tell you, oh, it's just this one thing. There's a lot of games in the world that have this, and because it's complicated, most of the community gives new players the impression that there's just 1 or 2 right answers. And there are a number of games I've played where that is the common consensus, and they are verifiably wrong. Yes, the stat soup erased the game's build system for most people. So I would say that having a lot of stats like this is pretty bad. It would have to be very good for it to not to overcome that badness, There's a reason that most of us probably haven't played very many games that we really enjoyed, that people think very highly of, that have this number of stats. There are some, I think. But I don't think it's a coincidence we haven't seen that many, because if you're going to put this much complexity in the game, you would need to find a way to convert that very large weight of learning barrier and like negative confusion and possible false complexity into some rather large benefits, or like a lot of little benefits, right? Just Rusty continues. As you may have noticed, there are a lot of stats on here. Don't worry, we're going to get through this. Primary stats are on the left. First row is for offense, damage, crit, resistance. Sorry, I got confused. Basic stats are health, mana, action points, movement speed. So this is the red thing at the top left. You see that? So there are 3 rows. It's a little 3x4 array. And you can see at the top there's health, mana, AP, action points, presumably how many things you can do in a round, and move, how many spaces you can move in a round. Interesting. Okay, so action points is how many things other than moving you can do in a round, I would guess. Then there's a second row for like damage stats, basically. Offense, damage, crit, resistance reduction, and accuracy. And then third one is defensive stats, block, armor, resistance, dodge. You'll notice already there's something, basically good that, not having played this game, I'm appreciating out of the gate, which is that things are vaguely color-coded. We're not talking about the gear stuff below that red box in this parlay, but you can see that it looks like those slots are vaguely color-coded. Maybe green is utility, or like mobility or something. You got the blue for defense and then the red for offense. And as is often the case, the stats in on the blue box in the lower right side are also vaguely color coded the way you would expect. Green is like you get more of a thing. Red is usually damage. There's purple, which I guess is mostly utility effects, like that propagation stat that we'll talk about later. And then you can see green for poison. A lot of them are the stereotypical color for that effect, sure. But it adds up in a system like this, right? If the game is consistent with that kind of stuff. I wouldn't even mind if the words for the names of the stats were themselves color-coded or grouped into, like offense, defense, like just like these are. But not a huge deal, just to say, there we are. Now, this is a perfectly serviceable set of stats that one could make a build system around, and indeed they have. While some stats, like action points, are universally good when picking from the options in the primary stat system, we're making choices about personal survival, defense and HP, versus survival of the objective, offense and mana, with action points and movement being universally good stats. Accuracy and resistance reduction are both only useful against enemies with high dodge or resistance, respectively, so we're making choices about whether to make one character who can deal with these types of threats and focus on it, or to spread a little of these stats across the whole team. Remember that we're defending a base with, you said, 3 to 6 characters, so it might at first seem odd. A good red flag for a system like this isn't resistance reduction and accuracy having both of those a bit redundant? And, well, but if there are multiple different characters, then having a specialist for enemies with high resistance, and then a specialist for enemies that are dodgy, could make a big difference. And of course, outright dodging an attack is different qualitatively than always tanking the attack, but taking less damage from it. For example, we're going to talk about chain lightning abilities later, and you can imagine that an enemy with high resistance could still be a very effective target for chain lightning because they'll kill all the small things around them while taking steady damage. Whereas a target that dodges a lot, you might not get off anything most times, and if most of the attack's value is in its chain lightning, and missing makes the chain lightning not trigger, again, this is just an example, I don't know if that does happen, then you would lose value there. So there is some room to specialize. What we're doing here, basically, at great length, because it's complicated, this is a long parlay, but I don't think this is particularly verbose, like it takes a long time to unpack this, is saying, are there purposes to all of these stats being in the game? And, it's debatable, but like to what extent? Of course. Cool. There's also a little bit of a fly in the ointment here in that you only get to pick from one of 6 options each level up. Oh, that's pictured. Here, let me time travel and show you that. We'll just take a look at it for a minute. So here you can see when you level up, how you get these stats is you get presented with some options, but they're also at different rarities. So I assume the higher rarity is you get more of the stat. It's not that the stat itself is necessarily rarer. You get offered primary attribute options, and a higher rarity will mean you'll get more of them. So you need to keep in mind what about your build is going to be useful later so that you can make sure to pick up like that rare move points or whatever when it comes up so that your build has that. That critical looks pretty good. And they are varying rarities, with some things like movement and action points only appearing at higher rarities. Okay, there we go. So it's that as well, because they're universally good, and stats coming in higher quantities at increased rarities. You get 2 rerolls each level. You can see those on the side, and they carry over between level ups, but each time you roll, you see less options. So taking mediocre stats is often better than gambling, and the reroll button is kind of only something being incentivized if none of your options are remotely positive. Or making choices such as, is a rare amount of block on a character I want on the backline more or less valuable as an emergency measure I may use only once, compared to a common roll of damage, which I will use every turn, but it's just not that much damage. Or should I reroll to hope for uncommon or rare mana accuracy damage? Right. And so one purpose we've seen of there being a variety of stats is that there can be these trade-offs. There are enough stats that there will be a handful that are likely to show up in these random stat offerings that are pretty good for the build, that are okay for the build, and that are not useless, but you're not going to use them that often. And so, sure, that creates those interesting trade-offs. I'm not convinced the best way to achieve that is to have them be offered randomly, but I'm not immediately sure. That's certainly the most straightforward way I can think of to do that. But anyway, okay, interesting, but good explanation. So certainly some reasons for there being that variety of stats. You know, if a character is offered like super rare resistance reduction or whatever, maybe you say, well, I wasn't really planning on them being that specialist, but it would be a good use of this opportunity presented to me to just go with that. I do want someone who's doing that anyway. If I can get them to do this, then I get a payoff by having, you know, a lot of it in this big block. That's what I'm imagining anyway. Where the stats start getting spicy is the secondary modifiers. We always talk on this parlay how having as many different multipliers as possible is normally best. Well, that it gives you the most damage. Not having the most multipliers as possible in the video game, but when you are playing the video game, using as many different multipliers as possible. Yes. Lightning quick crash course on the multiplier situation. So, right, in a lot of games, players have a tendency to make what I think of as like theme or keyword builds. I'm making a crit build, or I'm making a status build, or I'm making a fire rate build, or whatever it is. When, mathematically speaking, is nearly universally better in all video games to do the exact opposite of that and spread out the multipliers, get a little crit and a little status and a little fire rate, etc., provided that they all affect the same thing. They all multiply the same thing. This is why something like attack speed or multi-shot in Warframe is a memorable example, more bullet per bullet, why those stats are so good, because they usually give you more of everything regardless of what you're doing. As long as the thing you're doing is something you can repeat, it usually means you just get more of everything. They're kind of universal multipliers, I guess. And what we're going to go on to talk about is how this game has a lot of multipliers on offer. A lot of multipliers. You remember that sheet from before? In fact, yeah, that's, you know, it seems like a lot, right? But the key big but is that not all of them affect everything. Last Spell tips this on its head and says, okay, but what if we gave you a truly boggling number of multipliers of different flavors, each with very specific conditions, and made some of them really hard, but theoretically possible to use simultaneously? Okay, so this is pretty interesting. Kind of the crux of this parlay is this. Most games take a really non-nuanced approach to multipliers. There are games that take, I think, a nuanced at all approach, but just not that interesting of a one. Some games don't know about this at all, and we're not going to worry about those for now. There are plenty, I would argue most games in the current gaming industry that have a build system, that are demonstrably in some way about making a deliberate build, haven't even thought about separate multipliers. Like, it has not occurred to the developers that that is a thing, or it hasn't occurred to enough of them and they didn't speak up or something. Look, I don't know. I'm sorry. I can't give you credit. Most games that have build systems just don't seem to have noticed this. But a good amount of games have, thankfully, and there's a variety of approaches. One of them, the ones I've seen, the usual ones I've seen, are to not do them. So this approach is interesting. You make it so nothing in the game multiplies with anything else, or taking separate stats isn't how you get multipliers. A couple of examples of this would be like Hades 1. Usually when you get a damage increase, it just adds to the total amount of damage increase you already have. And also I just had an example right on the tip of my tongue. Oh my goodness, that's going to make me so frustrated. Please. I hate it when that happens. Games that just don't do multipliers, pretty much. Right, Dead Cells. So in Dead Cells, when you get more of a colored stat, you get more of it the more of it you've taken. They're slightly scaling it such that it cancels out the diminishing returns you already would have gotten. You get 10% more damage, basically, or whatever it is, per, stat scroll you get. And if you've taken the stat multiple times, you start getting a little more than 10% numerically, but that's just because the total amount you have means that getting 10% more wouldn't be that good. If I do my base damage and I get 10% more damage, I do 110% damage. But if I already do 100% more damage, gaining 10% more damage won't be as noticeable. Now I only do 5% more total damage. So Dead Cells just gives you the difference so that you always do like the same amount more total damage every single time. Dead Cells has made it so picking the same thing over and over again like kind of avoids the separate multiplier issue. Interesting approach, because I don't think they want the game to be about that, and that's fine. I'm not saying these are bad solutions, but they do kind of like not answer the question. You know, the only answer is to not play at all, which I guess fair enough. It's funny because Hades 2 is then a pretty good example of using multipliers in an interesting way. But anyway, you can make them harder to get. That's a common one. So it's easy to get more damage, but it's harder, and the game represents it as more fancy or expensive to get like more damage. Or the game is meant to be a puzzle where you figure out how to fit things that are multipliers for as much as possible. This is we have them, but we just make it somewhat challenging to get them. An example I think that illustrates the idea is Vampire Survivors. In Vampire Survivors, weapons have various qualities that will increase their damage, and usually weapons have some things that won't increase their damage. Flight speed of a weapon would increase the damage of a weapon that spins around you because it will hit the same enemy more times or more quickly or more enemies around you, but doesn't increase the damage of attacks that don't move, of weapons that when they fire don't move around, right? And so if you make a build with a weapon that moves quickly and you want to use that weapon flight speed passive item as a damage increase, well, it behooves you to try to find the rest of your build worth of weapons that also benefit from flying around faster. And you can make a build that does more or less damage by making this work more or less completely for all of your stuff that you pick. And the game is interestingly balanced like that. It is a little more in that puzzle category I suggested earlier, but there you go. Another interesting approach I've seen is the kind of rotation opportunity cost. You can easily get separate multipliers, but you have to set them up. So this would be like you're playing a mage-like character, and you could throw fireballs at the enemy, and you have an ability that debuffs the enemy and makes them take more fire damage. But because you can only be casting one spell at a time, you do have to spend the time to cast the debuff. And so think about what happens if we give you more debuff spells that are separate multipliers when you do fire damage, but you need to like activate all of them. And so there's a sort of economy of time is the opportunity cost instead. Interesting approach that's reasonably common. World of Warcraft comes to mind. But then this approach is really weird. The idea is that it's just really hard to use the multipliers, basically. Pretty cool. So let's give some examples. Diving into the melange. Mana and regen and HP regen makes sense. The game is a day-night cycle. You do one fight, then you do some buildcraft, then you fight again. The regen stats define how much of these resources you get back during each fight. So you can see at the top daily mana regen and daily health regen of that blue box. Mana regen often ends up being more of a throttle than total mana over the course of a run, so is sort of a damage multiplier in that it lets you use more of your big AoE utility skills. Remember, every weapon has some abilities that use mana. Health regen, on the other hand, is kind of a dead stat unless you're using certain perks, which can turn it into other stats at high conversion rates. You could imagine something like you take a little damage when you attack an enemy or fire an attack, but it does more damage, and so maybe then you can convert that health regen into something useful. Reliability, okay, is theoretically fascinating. There it is, the third stat. What is the icon? Anyway, if practically underwhelming as a multiplier, instead of increasing maximum damage, it brings your minimum damage values closer to your maximum damage values. Oh, it's squeezing the brackets? Is that what that was? Unfortunately, the math isn't quite good enough on this one, even if I love the concept. We're typically only taking this one if it's higher rarity, and the other options actually cannot be used on the archetype the character is building. But it would be interesting to see if a lot of the time a stat like that will be good in a very specific niche. Then we have the multipliers for specific flavors of damage. You got physical, range, magic. which are big damage buffs, but lock your character into certain combos. Now, the fact that characters are classless means all characters can use all weapon types. So with these stats, your trade-offs are take 1 damage type and only pick from a third of the weapon options. Take 2 and lose raw numbers for versatility, or none of these stats, or the occasional smidge of each if we roll bad, and keep the character's build options open, but at the cost of damage. Sure, cool. So that explains why multiple weapon options. Again, you can see as we go through, there are some decent reasons to have like those 3 stats, for example. So far, I feel like they're doing pretty good. You're at least able to quickly explain what you feel like the points of each of the stats are. Keep continuing to move down. Critical power is dependent on having taken crit as a primary stat. I would imagine critical power here means critical damage. The damage of a crit when you crit is higher. Anyway, you need enough crit as a primary stat, crit chance, to make it come online. Because of the way crit perks work in this game, and because stat gains are incremental at each level, crit-based characters tend to want to ignore other stats to focus on crit and only come online later. Normally not an axiom we at Zandy Incorporated believe in, but the math actually checks out. There's a lot of crits you get you more crit synergies in the perk tree that make this true. Sure, and also consistency. Crit is a stat that tends to be a little bit of an oddball in the multiplier soup, the stat soup, even at the best of times, because crit becomes more reliable as you get more of it up to a point as well, and crit damage does nothing unless you crit, and so crit damage is often made to be a pretty powerful multiplier in terms of raw stat value because you need to build crit chance to enable it. And so, yeah, another thing is that I know that a lot of developers think about this less than they think about the fact that players like to build like just a crit build, for example. That's like a really common, well-known, I sort of wish we could do something to sort of step that back perspective that a lot of players have. And so I know that one of the reasons that crit often is more rewarding to stack in these games is because a lot of developers just know players would do that, and so they want to make that thing good. I feel like that is a good-hearted but short-sighted approach. There are many benefits to not making crit just unga bunga snowball, but having some build variety isn't bad either, so that's interesting to know. I actually don't think that's as uncommon as it might seem, but certainly the axiom that you should mix all your multipliers isn't 100% perfect, of course. Just that all things being equal, you'd want to mix them. If the game gives you way more of something, then sure, like multipliers are just damage at the end of the day. You can have adding surpass multiplying. You just need to add a lot. And so if the game does add a lot, then fine. You know, it's more than multiplying sometimes. And I'm sure that some multipliers still work with crit builds. You're just saying often it's good to just like really go crazy on that. Sure. Then we get to my favorite stats of the entire game and why I made this whole parlay. The design is just chef's kiss, opportunism, and reliability. So opportunism is there at the bottom of the left column of that blue box. And then where's reliability? Sorry, you mean isolation. That must be a typo. Isolation right below that. Yep. And I can see on this build you took a lot of opportunism and isolation from what it looks like anyway. Cool. Okay. These multipliers come in truly enormous quantities in the level up screen. You get a lot of them when you get them, but require you to really think through engagements against enemy groups. Opportunism only kicks in if the enemy has any debuff on it. And isolation only kicks in if the target has no orthogonal enemies next to it. Significant when fighting enemies in the quantities involved in the hordes the game uses. Remember, you're fighting 100 plus enemies a night. So an enemy being isolated is maybe a little bit harder than it might sound. Certain weapons or weapon sets also have moves which multiply this multiplier. Ooh, they square it? For example, a dagger might have 2x isolation on some of the moves in its set. Whoa. This means the isolation stat is doubled, not that there's a 2x multiplier against isolated enemies, but that any damage will be increased if isolated or opportunism apply with any weapon that you have if you have that stat. Wow. Yeah, so there are some of the stats where, because the game has set up the design where some stats are difficult enough to turn on, they can make those multipliers even more rewarding. But in exchange, you have to play in a particular way. You have to do some extra work to get the multiplier to work at all. They don't give you damage unless you do the work, so the multiplier goes even crazier. And I think it's a really interesting choice to make it be not just bonus damage, but you get a bonus multiplier. Like, that's a bit interesting and has been uncommon in my experience. The idea that if you build into this, you get a little bit of extra reward. And you can imagine how having all of your damage dealers have these stats would really never be ideal. You wouldn't want it to be that a big horde of enemies approaches and all of your characters are built isolation, because it gets doubled and doubled, and the doubling is doubled when enemies are isolated. At the beginning of the wave, nothing will be isolated, right? So it's a stat that is well designed for, it's going to be good to have some of, but you probably really don't want everybody to have this. Like, it would probably be really bad to build everybody like that. Once again, we can see that these stats seem to be justifying themselves pretty well. A lot of these stats seem like they would lead to build variety. You would want to build a few characters that's a high value target, but it's also, and then at the same time, really bad to have everybody have it. It also reminds me a bit of something like D&D. Rogues are the obvious corollary here. You get a big pile of sneak attack damage if you can get it off, but needing everyone in your party to trigger sneak attack or they don't do good damage is rough. Like, that sucks. I've played a party like that. Actually, it was not fun. We stopped very quickly, or I just multi-classed. And there's some good multi-classes for that. So multi-class and a ranger. Or I've heard an interesting option is paladin, actually. But anyway, it's interesting, not good. And that's a great example of that. And that's awesome, isn't it? Like, what a good fit for a build system that there are multipliers where there's a thing in the build system where it's good, but it's bad if you use a lot of it. Like, if you don't make a choice about it, if you don't deploy it tactically, it's not good, but it is still good to use. It's a good tool, but it's not the single right answer. And this stat has been set up in a way where it is kind of almost like guaranteed to do that. It's not just a matter of the player's perspective. It is sort of undeniable. I mean, I haven't played this game, but I'm just imagining that it would feel that way. That's very cool. Yeah, I see why you were excited to talk about that. Neat. Skill range is interesting, as taking points in this lets you take less points in movement. Characters basically need lots of one or some of both of these stats, and choosing whether to take that dip out of primary or secondary stats is interesting. Oh yeah, that is cool, isn't it? So where is that stat? Skill range. Oh, there it is. The second row of the blue box. So this would increase how far away in, it's like a turn based on a grid is what I'm imagining. How far away in range you can use your skills. Now, obviously, if you have range attacks and you have a good amount of skill range, you might not need to move as much, but also some attacks might be melee, and making those have further range, if you can do that, might not always allow you to still hit enemies. You might still want some movement. And I would also imagine there's payoffs for just moving a lot. You're going to bring up one in a minute. So yeah, the idea that there's a big impact to customizing characters that way, but then the further layer that one of these is a primary stat in the red box and competes with other primary stats, while the other one is a secondary attribute that competes with those stats. Pretty interesting. So some builds are going to want to just deal with it. Sort of just deal with it and use range, even though it's not completely ideal, because their primary stat points are more precious to them, for example. This is cool. Yeah, having it be that there are multiple places in the build system where you can get something, multiple slots available that you can expend to get something the build wants, but what you get isn't exactly the same. This is a big flaw, in my opinion, with something like Warframe. Warframe has this very distinct thing about its build system where there are many different slots, and increasingly you can exchange a quite wide variety of those slots to get a large number of stats that you'd want. But the problem is you usually get this basically the same thing regardless of where you spend the slot. You might get it at a better rate, but you more or less can get it from wherever you want, which makes the build system quite where is just the most efficient place for the amount I want to get this, given what I'm using on my build. Not a decision where you go, well, there are consequences to getting it here. I have to play differently if I get it here. I think that's cool. Yep, very cool idea. So again, you can see a benefit they found to having there be multiple different stats. I'm fairly impressed so far, from a stat perspective anyway. I don't mean to be mean at all. I feel like at this juncture, it is worth briefly saying, This doesn't mean the game is fun for a given person. Just to say that the build system, like, yeah, I feel like they thought through what these stats would be for. That's very exciting. I think you'll find that if you analyze most games this way, it won't make sense. Like there isn't a clear reason, or you will consistently not be able to find, consistently and consistently, there will be a reason for all the stuff being in the game. There won't be a clear design benefit to that thing being in there. You might just not be able to find it, but I think if you do this to a lot of games, you will find that you fairly consistently, games are inconsistent about this. Whereas I feel like here, yeah, it's not that hard to, I don't think, to figure it out. I mean, I do this for a living. Maybe nobody can relate to the thing I just said. Poison damage, experience gain, and stun chance are all fascinating. Stun chance and poison in particular for their interaction with opportunism. We don't have time to discuss them in detail as they're going to bloat an already big parlay. Each of these stats need more context around the overall build systems involving them to really discuss. Right, opportunism was the enemy has a status effect on them, and so you can imagine how poison and stun chance, poison damage, but then stun chance, sure. If stunning counts as a status effect, then opportunism and stun chance could go very well together. And then poison damage, not necessarily duration. I can see what you mean. There's probably a need to unpack that, but cool. Yep, it makes sense that those things would, I mean, even on a basic level, right? Like stun chance, so you can protect yourself. It's a different form of survivability that maybe has an offensive benefit from opportunism. And then poison damage, your classic source of damage over time. And notice that there are not 5 different damage over time effects that have nebulous benefits and detriments to each of them, right? Like there's just, it seems like there's just the one, or at least one primary one. Pretty interesting. Just because we're doing a ton of different stats doesn't mean we just do a ton of everything. What are some stats we can put in the game? No, don't do that. Most of these are not obvious or things you haven't heard of that often in other games, and it skips a lot of the ones that you have heard of. This might be too basic for a parlay like this, but just to say that most games, I think a lot of the trouble begins simply because developers try to fill out the space with like a bunch of effects. A build system that is very crisp and simple and offers you very few but very impactful choices is wonderful. It's only not wonderful for shallow marketing, where it feels like you're showing that there isn't a lot in your game, but I'm sorry, you have to pick whether you want to appeal to people who don't really think about the games they play, or whether you want to make a good game, if you're going to do that. And in this case, you have a chance to do both. If you're willing to put in the work, it could be good to put a lot of stats in the game, which will shallowly look appealing. People will think the game has some shallow idea of depth, but also like have various benefits. But in most games, I think the build system is ruined the moment the developers go, oh, well, what status effects could we do? No, you're supposed to put them in when they provide some fun for the player, not just to check them off. Like that's, anyway, fantastic. Good. Yes. Happy so far. And by that, I mean, we're 2/3 of the way through the parlay. We then come to the last category of multipliers: propagation, multi-hit, and momentum. These stats all require specific weapon sets to switch on. Weapons with a propagation move, such as the spellbook's lightning or the hammer's earthquake, work by hitting the first target, dropping in damage, and then hitting a random orthogonal enemy, then hitting another and another, etc. The random nature of these can make it difficult to use unless you shape a horde, and hitting loose enemies at the edge can rob you of bounces if a bounce goes somewhere it can't jump to after killing something in a route. Enemies can be hit by multiple bounces though, so big enemies in pairs are also good targets. You can imagine then how propagation bounces has this interesting thing where it has its own diminishing returns. You lose damage every bounce. So +2 might be surprisingly close to where it isn't that good anymore. And also, if you get too much of it, then it won't give you full value except in a very large group of enemies, which you could probably plan around, but maybe that isn't as good. So this is another thing. It's quite nice to have things in a build system that it's intuitive to the player without thinking about math, that getting a lot of it won't be so good, that a little bit of it is really good. It would almost always apply for it to propagate like once or twice, but that 6 times is unrealistic, something like that. And great, yeah. In some ways, I feel like maybe the better solution is for the game to just say Like, hey, have you noticed that phenomenon of mathematics where if you get more of something, then you don't get as much of a relative benefit for each additional amount that you get? Have you noticed that thing about mathematics? So yeah, we'll just leave that here. Go have fun with the game. You see what I mean? To an extent, I sort of feel like, and this happens a lot in our game design discussions, a lot of game design problems for build systems could be solved by the developer just writing you a sentence that says a thing about how you could perceive reality, or like you could make it immersive if you wanted to. The sage tutorial character says, the old wizards would use a variety of different techniques to make sure that their bullshit didn't do no damage. Like, make sure not to stack your lightning too much. Nobody ever fights 20 enemies at once, like, or whatever it is. And then if the player does fight 20 enemies at once, maybe they'll go, huh. And then sure, maybe sometimes it's good, fine. But I do kind of feel like this is a nothing burger of a problem in a lot of game design. You could just lift a finger and it would be solved. That being said, it is very elegant for stats to kind of naturally not be like really, really OP if you stack a lot of them. I think that is beautiful, but also it sort of doesn't matter, and I feel like there's a way easier solution. Anyway, cool. That's really cool. It's not a flaw. Just a notice that we probably shouldn't need that to be a problem that we need to solve. Okay. Certain specific multi-hit moves on weapon sets may let you hit multiple enemies in range or the same enemy multiple times. Getting an increase to this stat, the multi-hit stat, increases how many times. So you can see multi-hits +1 there, the target. This stat hits diminishing returns very fast. Making a 2-hit weapon a 3-hit is an enormous increase. By the time you're making that 5-hit weapon a 6-hit, it's less of a jump, and the game limits that stat to 5 to avoid this buildcraft trap. Interesting. We'll get back to that if we have time. But right, again, another intuitive one where logically, if you hit twice and then you hit a third time, that's huge. But if you already hit 10 times, hitting an 11th time isn't as big of a difference. Momentum weapons do more damage based on how far the hero has moved up to a cap since they last used a momentum skill. Momentum moves work like opportunism and isolation in that the individual moves multiply this stat, but the stat only applies if you use a momentum weapon, not on all damage. And this would be a way that you can convert the primary stat of movement into damage. You can build momentum, that final stat at the bottom right of the blue box. And then you can build movement, a primary stat in that top left red box, and this would be a way to convert those primary points into a source of secondary multiplier that multiplies itself. Also notice, very satisfyingly, that opportunism and isolation, two of the other stats we talked about, which can multiply their multiplier with certain weapons or whatever, are both like secondary, and their enablers are secondary. So like opportunism, stun is also a secondary stat. Opportunism can be a multiplied multiplier, and a way to turn it on is to stun enemies, which is also a secondary stat. Momentum is a multipliable multiplier, but the way to turn it on is a primary stat instead, which could influence what you choose to do. Once you've iterated all of those combinations, the multipliable multiplier is a primary stat maybe, and then a secondary stat turns it on. It's a primary stat, and a primary stat turns it on. It's a secondary stat, and a secondary stat turns it on. You're done. Don't make more. It's not good to have more. It's just good to fill out the options so the player has those interesting weights to consider. And I think the key thing here is, right, you kind of have to play differently to activate each one as well. Very good. Good. That's what it's all about. Now we've talked about the restrictions on certain types of multiplier, we can come back to talk about why we might not want certain ones on certain builds. Propagation build with a spell book, a weapon set that gives the move Chain Lightning, probably isn't going to want to pick up isolation as a stat, as it requires enemies being grouped up. They might want to take magic damage as another stat, and take another magic weapon, or perhaps it would be better to take another weapon with a propagation effect like the hammer, which also stuns, and then take opportunism and stun chance. It's such a juicy system. Early on, it's often important to stick to relatively universal stats and see what weapon sets you roll with, good values later, but also, you might see something in a character's perk tree that synergizes with a certain stat, and focus on making sure you pick weapons for that character which revolve around that stat, even if the values on those particular weapons aren't 100% optimal. There's a lot of RNG floating around, meaning every squad I've had by the end of the run has been wildly different, but you have enough tools to put your thumb on the wheel and steer the direction of the hero's development. Might end up doing a two-parter on what Last Spell actually does with the soup next month, though, as I think I've ran on long enough. Indeed, it was a very long parlay, and parlay have been long in general recently, but I'm trying to adapt to this by doing ones where we sort of do commentary as we go. It's okay to just want to talk about these, and I would like to be able to accommodate that. So I don't know, I think this one went pretty well. As usual, I'm awed by your examples. Like, that's a very, very good example. Like, that was not hard to talk about in that way. You did a good, well, I don't know. I'm practiced at that. I don't want people to feel bad if they think that would be hard. But you had very good examples. That was a pretty good explanation. I like that you just went through every stat. That's a very me in a video thing to do. Like, we're just going to do all of it. That's why we have this block of time. So great. I love it. Yeah, and so I really like the idea that some multipliers are big enough to surpass others. Some multipliers, you multiply the multiplier. You can get enablers for different multipliers from different stat pools, resources. That's interesting. I did want to say that one of the things that stuck out to me with this one is that this is a game that it would really help if you could take notes, like flag stats that you especially want, even if it's just like favorites listing them or something. So a little icon pops up when they're offered in that like random level up stats screen. Or the player can write on type on a little notepad next to the game that pops up whenever their stats appear. I find it surprising that so few games, there are a few games I've seen that have something like this. I find it surprising that so few games include such a thing, even if it was just in the options menu, because it's an unbelievably simple thing to add to a game. You're basically just adding a notepad to the game. I reckon that some games think, well, that's why you don't bother adding it, because it's so easy. Indeed, I have a notepad document for almost every game that I enjoy making builds in, because it's not that fun to try to remember all that stuff all at once. I want to just enjoy the game. But it would be better if that was in the game. It would make a difference if you didn't have to go outside the game. Like having a first-party wiki inside of the game, there's a big difference between that and just kind of letting it work itself out on the internet. Sometimes games come along where a wiki would have been very valuable, but the community just doesn't happen to make a very good one, and so that makes the game significantly worse. You can't really know how anything works. Another thing is that obviously a first-party wiki has some more authority. You can hopefully feel confident that the developers actually tested the things in the game. I've always thought, and something I really want to try, one of the number one things that motivates me to do my own game design, is I've always thought that it would be a good tactic to try to just show the player the actual formula in the game, like the code the game is actually using, not the code, but like the formula in the code the game is actually using to compute their damage. And then you could just use some clever like CSSE stuff to make it so it looked more readable to the player. Don't make it the literal math equation, but represent it that way. And so the developer that way can't as easily be wrong, because they're showing the player the literal equation that is being used in some form. I think that is doable. A lot of aspects of math, like putting something in parentheses and multiplying this, but then adding this, -1 or whatever, can be converted into a sort of plain English. Like, you can just write them as words to an extent. And I think that would make a big difference for a lot of people. If you don't show them the equation, but you basically do show them the equation, you just write a lot of the parts of the math as a word that means that thing. Or, for parentheses, right? If I say something like 2 plus, 3 times 5, you can say something like, after you multiply this stat with this other stat, you add this stat, rather than showing the parentheses. You multiply these first, and then after that is done, you add this, rather than showing the equation itself. I feel like would be very easy and would make a big difference for a lot of players. A lot of people are literally just allergic to math. And you know what? I get it. Our school system has broken a lot of things about our creativity, but it's not actually that complicated most of the time. It just looks intimidating and reminds you of the sort of vague trauma of being in our incredibly broken education systems all over the world. So I don't know, maybe you had a way more functional schooling than I did, but that messed me up for a long time and was definitely not worth it. It's not that school as a whole wasn't worth it, but that I don't know, like college, I should have skipped more classes. Like that was rough for no real reason. Even though I learned a lot of it was the stuff I did, not the stuff that happened in the class, and it did a lot of damage. So I don't know. I personally feel like, again, this is something where, yeah, it's a problem. I know why a lot of games don't just give you the equation. Sure, it's kind of obvious when I say it that way. But at the same time, it's not that hard to do something about that. Come on, if we like lift a finger, and I'm sure we can figure it out. So I will say that I think it's unfair, right? This stat system is doing a lot of good. So it feels mean to say, oh, but that brings into focus how the part of the fun is the player having a plan for their build, and the game really doesn't do a lot about that. Again, this game specifically might actually, but many games are like this, where they do have a good build system, but they don't incorporate making builds into the game's design in any way. They just say, well, you go figure it out on your own, except that it's the primary thing you're meant to be doing on this screen. But we would consider it weird to help you in any way. And it's like, well, but why? That wouldn't be weird. Like that's what you just said the game is about. It would be exactly the most expected possible thing for you to let me like take notes or whatever in the game. And then taking notes, people don't like that. And so wish listing is popular then. I think a system that kind of auto takes notes, that's an idea. You wish list things and the game writes notes for you about those things to an extent, and then we'll let you edit them or something like that. That's an idea. Write that down. Wishlisting things in a game creates auto-generated notes for the player, and then they can edit them if they want. Also pictures. Let the player put pictures of stuff in the game in the notes. That is, like, don't limit the notes to being only text. It should be pretty easy to let the player just insert the icon for a given weapon into the notes, and I think a lot of people would really like that. Again, a lot of the problem here, unfortunately, doesn't have anything to do with actual game design in the abstract, but is just because almost all of humanity has been kind of scarred about taking notes, as if it's this awful thing. And if you do that for a little while, you will eventually grow out of that, sure. But I don't think it's entirely fair for games to just hope the entire education system changes, or for the game to be fun, the player has to have, on their own time, disarmed the entire education system and its damage on their brain. Like, that's not going to be realistic, maybe ever, in human society. So unfortunately, I think this is one where the game does need to do the work. We can't just hope the world gets better. That's just not likely going to happen, unfortunately. And it wouldn't be very hard for the game to do. So yeah, really cool. I liked this parlay. Yeah, do a two-parter. I think what would be interesting with these systems is, obviously the part I'm excited to break down is the buildcraft, and like a little bit of the, not math, but like the ways mathematically that the build system would be good and the stats would have purposes. But obviously it matters a lot what those are used for. I hope it doesn't trouble you that I am not that much more excited to play this game than I was before from hearing this, because there are lots of games that this part is great, but the gameplay just isn't fun, and so I don't like, who cares, I don't know. I mean, this one, it seems like a lot of the stats, if that stat is good, the gameplay almost has to be a certain amount of good, like opportunism, isolation, and the propagation stats make me feel like, well, if stunning enemies, creating hordes of enemies funneled through a choke point, and isolating enemies is good and is a thing in the gameplay, that kind of means that the attackers have to be dynamic enough for those things to apply, but not apply all the time, which almost means the game is going to be good. Either that or those stats would just be bad, basically. So I'm moderately encouraged to be interested, but it's just the build system. This is why in my own spreadsheet I rate the build system and my overall feeling about the game separately, and those are almost never the same score. The build system is almost always one of the least congruous parts of a game as well. The build system will often be the worst or the best part of the game, and the rest of the game will be of a decisively different quality and a much more consistent quality, and then the build system will be the outlier, which is extremely frustrating, but also fascinating. That's sort of part of what's keeping me going doing this. So folks, if you'd like to submit your own parlay like this one, we'd love to have you. You can do that using a link in the description. You submit whatever you like. It doesn't have to be something this long, though it certainly may be. As long as it's something I could do in a 45-minute chunk, you're good to go. Looking forward to the next one.